The road turned to gravel, then to dirt. Sarah Parker's old Subaru rattled like a drawer full of loose silverware, the check engine light winking at her like it had a sense of humor. And she didn't. The forest swallowed the road in a green tunnel. Ferns knelt against the ditches. Moss shrouded the trunks of firs that reached higher than church steeples, and a thread of fog hung low, like a blanket someone forgot to pull up. Somewhere, water moved, the sound dim and constant. She hadn't checked the time since she left the interstate. The baby had an elbow pressed against her rib, in a way she'd learned meant, "You're going to need to stop soon." Her hands tightened on the steering wheel when the cabin finally appeared in the dappled light. Tilted, as if time had leaned on its shoulder for a century. It was smaller than she remembered from a childhood photo, weathered cedar and a rusty tin roof, one crooked porch step, a window with lace curtains yellowed by the decades. The forest pressed in on three sides, but the small clearing felt like a breath, a circle of soft grass and an old apple tree leaning sideways like it wanted to watch. The baby kicked and her eyes stung. She shut the engine off, and the silence was like stepping into an old church, sacred and a little frightening. She'd meant to be strong for this moment, to stand on the porch like in the memory of a Lifetime movie and swear to make a new start. What she did was press her forehead to the steering wheel and cry until hiccups threatened to set off a contraction. It had been 3 weeks since she'd lost her job, and 2 weeks since she'd found out her replacement had already been in training before they restructured. 10 days since the landlord slid the eviction notice into their door jamb like a business card. 6 days since she stopped waiting for a text from Isaiah that would never come. He'd left a note. He was not ready for fatherhood. He was not ready for responsibility. He wasn't ready for this or us or a baby with a tiny profile nose on the ultrasound picture that looked like hers. He'd signed his name to the bottom in a movement that had probably taken him 15 seconds and cost her sleep for the rest of her life. She had nowhere else to go. Her grandmother had left the cabin to her 6 years ago, a gift she hadn't known what to do with then. "Just in case," Grandma June had said, pressing an old key into Sarah's palm. Everybody needs a just in case. Sarah had thought just in case meant a weekend away, a story to tell at her wedding. Now it meant an address that wasn't nothing, care of nobody, a space big enough for a baby's crib. She opened the car door. The air was cool and smelled of damp soil and cedar and the faint sour sweetness of apples that had fallen and gone to rot under the tree. Her feet sank in the soft ground and the baby shifted, reminding her of her presence with a roll that pressed her belly against the cotton of her t-shirt. Her hand went to it automatically, a habit she'd grown without noticing. "We're okay," she whispered, and her voice sounded too loud. "We're going to be okay." She climbed the 3 steps, the second one squeaking and then cracking ominously, and stopped in front of the door. The paint had once been green. Now it flaked like a sunburn, and the old horseshoe had been nailed above the frame upside down, luck spilled out for decades. She took a breath and reached for the key around her neck. And if you enjoy stories like this, real people finding hope in forgotten places, do me a quick favor. Tap like and hit subscribe. It helps us grow and keeps these stories coming daily. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing the map of all of us out there listening together. Okay, back to this tiny, creaky door and the life waiting behind it. The key stuck in the lock and then caught, the stubbornness of age giving way with a sound like old bones cracking. The door complained as it opened. The sound layered, wood against wood, rust rubbing itself awake. Dust rose, and the smell of age, of 100 winters and 100 summers was a physical thing. Light filtered in through a single window, the dust motes each a planet you could almost call by name. The front room was one space, roughly square, with a small stone fireplace at one end, and shelves built into the wall with nails so old their heads were as wide as quarters. A rug lay on the floor like a sleeping dog. The kitchen started where the front room stopped, signaled by a different kind of broken linoleum. A table, a chair, a narrow bed that had belonged to nobody recently. Everything seemed both empty and full, as if the cabin was a chest that had been filled with the memory of the people who had lived inside it long after their bodies had gone. "Okay," Sarah said to the air, and it made a soft noise back she told herself was not an answer. She set her backpack on the table and began to open windows, adding the sound of stubborn sashes and creaking glass to the symphony. Air moved in like a blessing, carrying the smell of pine needles warmed by a thin sun. It almost smelled like the house was relieved. Her phone chirped with the last of the bars it would get before sighing into no service. She pulled it out, and the screen lit up with the text she'd been avoiding. Certified mail, delivery attempted. Her stomach sank. She'd known it would come. She had 18 messages from the water company, the electric company, the landlord, the hospital's billing department. The certified mail was from the county. She didn't open her email. She didn't need to know what the letter would say. Delinquent property, taxes, foreclosure pending. "You have 30 days. She let herself look. 30 days to pay $18,940 or forfeit the cabin at auction. 30 days to pay a number that had as many commas and zeros as the one she had ever made a plan to acquire. The baby shifted again, stretching, and she pressed her palm against the movement. "I know," she said, and her voice broke. I know. I'll figure it out." She turned on the tap, and nothing happened. She stared at it like it had personally betrayed her. "Right," she said to the sink, then to the baby. "We're going to need to figure out a lot." She set herself to work because work kept her from thinking. She tracked down the main shutoff in a cupboard and turned it, heard water grudgingly move through pipes that sounded like a complaining cat. Cold water trickled. She filled a pot and set it on the stove, and then remembered there was no power. She laughed in that way that is almost crying, and then saw the cast-iron stove against the far wall like a grandmother's shoulder, black and solid. There was wood in a box beside it, and a tin of matches on the mantel, their sides rough like a cat's tongue. She ate a banana and a granola bar she'd left in the car and unpacked a box labeled "Kitchen" in a hand that belonged to a person she barely remembered. The light moved across the floor like a traveler. She imagined herself in the future, telling a story about this day to a person whose hair smelled like baby shampoo and sweet milk. "It was falling apart," she would say, "and so was I, but we did it anyway." She tried to make herself believe it. That night, the cabin made sounds she had forgotten houses made, tiny movements, the breath of a structure remembering its foundation. Wind touched the sideboards and the trees sighed. She lay on the narrow bed with 2 blankets doubled, her belly like a hill, and listened to her breath and the strange, unkind emptiness of a home that wasn't yet hers. She wanted her mother. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. She wanted Isaiah to want her. She wanted the past to be different and the future to be sure. Just before sleep, she heard something that was not the house. It was a small sound, deliberate, like a whisper. She sat up, her heart kicking, and listened. It came again, a delicate clink, like a glass bead pinging against porcelain. It came from the corner of the room near the fireplace, where shadows made shapes that made shapes into stories. "It's nothing," she said, which is what you say when you are sure it is something. She took the flashlight from the crate she had placed by the bed, because if last week taught her anything, It was to keep things she needed within an arm's reach, and patted across the rug. The floor was cold and uneven under her socks, and a board near the fireplace squeaked, then gave, her foot sinking just enough to catch her off balance. Panic hit her. Protect the belly, protect the baby, and she grabbed the mantel, her other hand slamming against the stone to catch her weight. Something beneath the board made a different sound, a hollow thump. She crouched, breath shallow, and shone the light across the floor. The board that had dipped looked slightly different than its neighbors, its seam not quite flush. Her fingertips traced the edges. Paint had sealed it once, the ghost of it visible in a line that didn't meet properly with the one beside it. She wedged her nails into the gap and pried gently. The board moved, reluctant, as if it had an opinion. She was careful, as if she were handling a secret she didn't want to scare away. It lifted. Dark space opened. The smell of old wood and something sweet and gone, lavender or cedar. Her flashlight pierced the small square. There, snug like a rabbit in its warren, was a wooden box. Cedar, the kind of old that made it look softer than it was. The lid fitted with small brass hinges, tarnished green where the air had sneaked in. A keyhole punctured the front like a tiny eye. She sat back hard on the rug and pressed a hand to her sternum. She was tired and hungry and frightened, and all those things were magnifying this. Or maybe they weren't. Maybe this was the stranger thing. The timing you only recognize in hindsight and call providence because you have no better word for it. Her hands shook when she lifted the box out of the cavity and set it on the rug. The flashlight lay on its side, throwing a wedge of light that made the spice of dust look like stars. The box was cool and smooth. She closed her eyes and took a breath. Felt the baby roll like ocean water inside her. "Okay," she said to her, to the box, to whatever dead women might be leaning in to listen. "Okay." She carried the box to the table. The key around her neck fit many locks in her life, but not this one. She turned to the mantel, to the old things people put in places like this to look like charm and to mean luck. A blue glass bottle, a carved horse, a brass bell the size of a fist, a jar with buttons. No key. She slid the box around in her hands and then noticed where one corner had been rubbed smooth more than the others, like someone's thumb had lingered there for years. Beneath it, as if she had conjured it with noticing, the tiniest of seams. She pried it open with her fingernail and a sliver of wood lifted, revealing a tiny space no bigger than a postage stamp, and within it a tiny key, so perfectly fitted that it had been sealed from air and rust and time. She laughed, the kind of surprised, unhinged sound that sounds like crying anyway, because it was. The key turned. Inside the cedar box lay a coil of white ribbon, old enough to have the color of cream. Under it, written on paper that looked like parchment and felt like the thin skin of an onion, a small book wrapped in cloth. The cloth smelled unmistakably of cedar and something, faintly floral. She unwrapped it and found an old leather journal, the kind of thing people now bought in expensive stores to scribble about their feelings and take staged pictures of. This one had been the real thing. Its leather was cracked and had a color that reminded her of hot chocolate with too much cocoa. She lifted the cover, careful, and her heart stepped sideways. In slanted ink, the first page read, "Journal of E. Whitcomb, begun the first day of October 1919. Her grandmother's maiden name had not been Whitcomb. Her grandmother's maiden name had been Parker, same as hers. But Whitcomb rang like an old bell in the valley of her mind, a note she had heard once at a family reunion in a story told by a cousin about a great something who had come west with nothing but a hand-hewn chest and a baby in her arms. The story had felt as far away from her life as a fairy tale then. Sarah turned the pages, and the rich, sour smell of old ink rose. The handwriting was elegant and readable, a woman's hand taught on a lap with patience and a straight-backed chair. The first entries were small and careful. She read, October 1st, 1919. The rains began today. I am glad of them because the fires have been terrible in the Clackamas until now. Ash on the air and men looking at the hills as if they were watching something die. The baby kicks in a way I imagine is anger. Her breath caught. She kept reading, turned the page, the ink lightened and darkened with the pen's use. The voice on the page was dry and wry and alive. October 3rd. I found a place where the land is kind. I know the men say the land is only wood and ore and river and money, but I say it is a kind or unkind thing, and this place is kind. There is a flat spot like a table, and a stand of cedars like a choir, and a stone that looks like a woman's head looking toward the water. I have brought stones back in my pockets the way little girls bring home pretty things, because I did not yet have a home to bring them to. I found myself talking to the tree like my mother did when she was alone too long. I will build there. Later, entries told of a husband, Alton, killed under a red cedar when cables snapped like whips in the yard of the logging camp where they had worked. Of a man named Silas Holloway who had been generous and then careful and then cruel. Of a deed and a signature and a night when men came and signed and took and left her with words like necessary and improvements and progress that felt like the names for grief dressed up in Sunday clothes. In the end, one entry read, almost a year later, I have done the only thing I can imagine to do. I have written what is true and hidden what is precious. The journal was not a story. It was a trail. It gave pieces and withheld. It spoke in a code that was half love letter, half map. Whole pages were torn out, cleanly, carefully, like the person who tore them knew exactly how much information the remaining page would hold and wanted it that way. On the inside cover, shadowed like something written and then erased and then written over again, someone had doodled the shapes of leaves, cedar and alder and maple, and then, beneath, a square, like a room with a square within it. She read until the words blurred. She read until the baby turned and the night sounded like the inside of a shell. She woke with her cheek on the journal, ink pressed lightly into her skin like a temporary tattoo, dried, rambling shapes against the center of her lips like a kiss. The morning was gray at the edges and cold enough that her breath fogged. The day made her bruise from the night look like something she had imagined. She drew the curtains open and the cabin's single window turned green. She made a fire the way her grandmother had taught her, kindling and bark and a prayer and boiled water. The sink had stopped trickling, a problem for the list. She ate oatmeal she stirred with a wooden spoon and left a stripe in the bowl. The baby elbowed her as if to say, too hot. She opened the journal again. The torn pages were like missing teeth, drawing attention to their absence. The entries that remained were precise the way the mind of a person gets when it needs to protect itself. The sentinel watches still, she wrote once, and then, in the margin, an arrow and the letter S. In another entry, when the lantern woman faces north, the way is underfoot. And later, I have put the proof where iron sings in winter. Proof, Sarah said aloud, loving the click of the F at the end of it. It felt like a thing you could hold. She walked the small space, journal in hand, looking for that square, inside a square her hand kept returning to. When she stood with her back to the hearthstone and looked at the shelves, she saw it, the way the plaster had a hairline crack that was straighter than a crack should be. She pressed it and felt a tiny give. The journal told her, do not press. Listen first. Press only when you have found the bell. She laughed. How am I supposed to find... She stopped because she remembered the brass bell on the mantel, the one she had passed over as charm, no meaning. She lifted it. It was heavier than it looked, and the clapper struck the side when she tilted it and made a sound that made her eyes prickle. She set it on the square and pressed. The bell sang, and the square clicked and slid, revealing a small, shallow cavity the size of a photograph. Inside was a folded piece of paper so thin it might have turned to powder in her hands if she breathed too hard. She unfolded it with her breath locked inside her chest, and when she saw what it was, she had to sit down on the floor with her legs making an ungainly shape around her belly, the way the last of her girlhood hadn't known how to sit like that. It was a map. Sort of. It was a drawing that was a map in the way a poem is a map. A cedar branch drawn in a curve that matched the shape of the ridgeline outside the cabin. Little dots that could be trees or stars. And in the corner, a notation. Trust, the spring, proof. There was also, faint in a hand, different than the elegant slant of E. Whitcomb's, a signature. Silas Holloway. It was not a signature on a contract. It was the kind of signature you put under a letter when you want to be known. It made her mouth dry. Somebody knocked. The sound was so ordinary and so unexpected in the quiet that she jumped, then laughed at herself for being the cliché of the woman alone in the cabin who jumps when someone knocks. She stood slowly and walked to the door and looked through a curtain gap and saw a face wrinkled like creased paper and a pair of eyes the color of smoke that moved like they had not missed much in 90 years. Hair, white as milk, braided down her back. A cardigan that had started its long life as a bright pattern and made peace with being a memory of color. "Can I help you?" Sarah called through the door. "You can, but that's not why I knocked," the old woman called back, her voice firm. "I brought eggs." "Eggs?" "And cinnamon rolls because I believe in the power of flour and butter. Are you going to make me stand here?" A smile curled, sharp and warm at the same time. "Sorry," Sarah said, and opened the door. The old woman stepped inside with the assurance of someone who had been invited before she arrived. She carried a cardboard egg carton and a tin that smelled like sugar and nutmeg. "You're June Parker's granddaughter," she said, not asking. "You have her hair. I'm Mabel Hargrove. I'm 2 cabins down the ridge, across the old logging road, up where you can see the river when the leaves fall. I keep an eye on the place." "An eye?" Sarah repeated. "Or 2, Mabel offered. "Sometimes 4, if my cousin's over. He keeps an extra pair in his pocket for cards." She set the carton on the table and took in the room in a single sweep, like a camera on a dolly. "Your water running?" "Trickling. It stopped trickling. Shut off, probably corroded. I'll send my neighbor Boy. He's got a wrench and a back that hasn't betrayed him yet." "You've got heat?" "I have wood." "The old stove's a good one. Eat, you look faint. Baby looks like she agrees with me." Sarah began, and then began again. "Thank you. You can thank me properly by telling me the thing you're afraid to say." Sarah's throat closed. The journal lay open on the table. Mabel's eyes met it, then her face changed. A shadow of memory crossed it like a bird flying in front of the sun. She put a gentle finger down on the edge of the leather and touched it like it was a forehead. "You found her." "Her?" Sarah didn't realize until she said the letter out loud that she knew why. Mabel had said it. The handwriting had been a presence. The words had been a voice. She had been the kind of reader who forgot authors were real. Eleanor Whitcomb made sure she remembered. She was there. It was not a journal. It was a person. Mabel nodded. "Eleanor?" She said the name as if it were the first time she had said it in a long time. "You some kind of mine to find that?" "I looked for that journal in this house for 30 years, because I knew it had to be here, and then I gave up and figured I'd imagined it or made it into a story." "What made you look?" "I fell," Sarah said truthfully, And for the first time since she'd arrived, she let herself sit and feel the feeling she'd been holding off. Relief. She did not have to do this part alone. "Baby, all right?" "She likes to scare me." Sarah put a hand on her belly. "She's okay." Mabel's eyes softened. Good. The world needs girls who believe things are possible. The boys, too. But they get told that from the beginning. Girls have to learn it. Sarah thought about all the times she had told herself the opposite and nodded and didn't trust herself to speak. "June Parker, your grandmother. She was the first person I saw hold this journal. 48 or something. She'd come to tend to the place after her daddy passed. She was standing right there, dust in her eyelashes, and she had that leather book in her hands like a loaf of bread she'd just pulled out of the oven and didn't know who she was feeding yet. I asked her for it, nosy as a squirrel. She said no. I liked her for it. She took it with her when she left. She never told me what was in it, then it disappeared." The pride of an old grudge settled on Mabel's shoulders and then melted. "But here it is, and here you are, and here we are again, which is how you know the universe has a sense of humor." I think there's something in it," Sarah said, and felt her mouth go dry again because saying it out loud made it possible to be ridiculous. "Something that could help me. Because—" She raised the county's letter and it shook in her hand, both because it was light and because it was heavy. "I can't lose this place. I don't have anywhere else." Mabel read and her mouth hardened. "They'll take it and sell it to the highest bidder, and it'll go to some outfit with a name like North Star Woodland Holdings, and they'll log up to your porch and leave you with a view of stumps. I've seen it before. I'll see it again. Not if we can help it." "We?" Sarah said, and the word tasted like honey. "I've got 2 good eyes and the stubbornness of a mule, and 3 notebooks full of people's lies. But you're going to need someone who can make a stand in a room with a judge and say words with teeth. I'll call my cousin's boy. He's a lawyer. He hates it when I call him that like he's 10, but it keeps him honest. Evan. He comes from a long line of right and wrong, and he wants to end up on the right side of it. He'll meet you." "I don't have money," Sarah said, heat rising in her cheeks, the shame volcanic and familiar. "He'll take pie for payment," Mabel said. "And if he doesn't, I'll take the pie and he'll live anyway. You found the journal. Let's see if it tells us what we need." They spent the morning reading. Mabel's finger traced the words like she was learning them by Braille and remembering them at the same time. They mapped the metaphors to the land with the ease of women whose bodies had spent enough time in this forest to know it the way you know the features of your lover's face in the dark. The lantern woman was a rock outcrop a mile north, the one that looked like an old-fashioned lamp if you tipped your head. The sentinel was the great cedar that had been spared when the first loggers came through because it had been lightning-struck and people had decided it was a bad idea to anger whatever had done the striking. The iron that sang in winter could be a number of things in a place like this. The stove, the bell, the old logging hooks hung on a nail in the shed, or the ancient hand pump near the spring, which had squealed like a stuck pig the last time Mabel had tried to get water out of it in January. "There," Mabel said, tapping the map in the corner where the cedar branch curve matched a ridge. "That's the spring. And look, the little rectangle there." She chuckled. "That old woman was clever. That's the cottage. And this dot? That's the buried well the first cabin used. It caved in. Kids dared each other to get as close as they could and spit for luck. My brother fell in, and we had to get 6 men to haul his fool self out with a rope. He never lost the taste for trouble. And the word trust?" Sarah asked, letting the word sit in her mouth again. "A test pebble you set under your tongue to suck on when you're hungry." She thought of the way trust could mean a legal thing, and also the thing you do with a person for whom you would put your hand in the fire. She rubbed at the ink with her thumb like it could be warmed, Mabel's mouth set a bit. That could be a lot. It could be a trust, like the kind with bank accounts that don't forget, or a trust like the kind that says, I took the deed and put it where the men won't look because they never do, and you will because you have to. She leaned back and stretched her neck, and a vertebra popped like a player cracking his knuckles. We'll find out. Evan arrived with the afternoon, on foot, walking up the road like he had meant to go somewhere else and decided this way was better. He was 30, maybe early 30s, hair a little too long and a beard that looked like it was losing an argument with itself. He wore a shirt and tie under a wool coat like he had started the day in an office and decided he needed trees. He smiled like he'd been born with an apology in his mouth. Miss Hargrove, he nodded, you summoned me. I did, Mabel said. We need your law brain. Great, he said, not sounding like he meant it, and then sounding like he did when he met Sarah and saw the journal. His eyes had a softness she hadn't expected from someone in a tie. You're June's granddaughter. Everyone keeps saying that, Sarah said, and then heard the small defensive bite in her voice and regretted it. I'm sorry. Yes, I am. I'm Sarah. She held up the county letter. I have 30 days. He read and nodded like it was the 1,000th of these he had seen this month. They'll put it on the docket for the next auction date. They'll send a sheriff with a notice. They'll tape it up right where good people can see it. We could try to appeal. We could try to set up a payment plan with the county, but you're going to need a down payment at the very least. I don't have it, Sarah said, and her throat closed around the graininess of humiliation again. I have a kid on the way in 8 weeks, and I have an eviction letter and a car that's playing chicken with me in a jar with $34 in coins that smell like fingers. Then we need to find another way, Evan said, and it was not in the tone of someone offering platitude or false hope. It was simply said, like, we need to go that way around the fallen tree. He put a fingertip on the journal and his jaw worked. What's this? What we found, Mabel said proudly, like she had pulled a trout out of the river with her bare hands. Eleanor Whitcomb's journal. Evan's eyebrows flicked up. The name hit him. Whitcomb, he said under his breath. He turned pages the way a man touches a beautiful thing he is afraid of breaking. Do you know what you have here? A story, Sarah said, and then, for the first time, allowed herself to speak the rest. Maybe a lifeline. He tilted his head. His eyes moved differently when he read the page about Silas Holloway. He flinched. He cleared his throat. You know the Holloways own half this valley? They'll be at that auction with a check in their pocket big enough to pay somebody's kids through college and still have change to build another fishing lodge. And the thing that scares you? Mabel asked, her nose sharp. He looked at Sarah, then away. My mother's maiden name is Holloway. The sentence sat between them like a hot coal. Sarah waited for the sting to show. He kept going. Quick enough it suggested he had been bracing to say it. It doesn't mean anything except this. If your journal contains any mention of legal documents, deeds, grants, a trust created in the event of a wrong, if it contains any reference to a forgery, he wet his lips, then we can move. We can file for an injunction to stop the auction on the grounds of a contested title or an outstanding claim. If there's a trust, we can petition to have it reactivated and reviewed. If there's proof that the Holloways obtained title through fraud, he spread his hands. You could end up with a settlement that would not only pay the taxes but ensure you can keep the place. If we can find proof. He looked at the word trust on the map and pointed at it. This is our first step. They went outside, where the forest had shaken off the thin sun and settled into a benevolent gloom. Mabel fetched a walking stick she had leaned against the porch since the Eisenhower administration, and led them down a path that had been a path for so long it remembered itself even in summer and winter. The green moss on the logs was the kind of green that seems like it invented the color. A red-winged blackbird called once from a cattail and flew, its shoulder flashes like a pair of flags. The spring did not announce itself so much as it made itself known with the sound of water that is not a creek and not the wind, but something smaller, human-scaled, like breathing. It sat in a curve of earth that had been shaped by hands, continued to be shaped by water. A stack of stones made a little shelf, and on it an old tin cup, weathered to gray. Mabel picked it up reverently and set it aside. The old hand pump leaned beside the spring like a man in a story leaning on a rail, ready to tell you the plot twist. Its iron handle was red with rust, and when Mabel raised it gently and then lowered it, the sound it made was a keening whine that sent chills along Sarah's arms. "Iron singing," Mabel said, satisfied. She gave it a few priming pumps and water grudgingly came, tasting like dirt and stone and time. "Now what?" Sarah asked, looking at the ground, the possible scratching at her imagination like cats at a door. The map had a small X near here, but the scale was not a kind one. "Now we look for the place a woman would hide a thing a man would not think to look," Mabel said, and began to search with purpose. She tapped stones with her stick. She lifted a clump of ferns gently, like she was checking for sleeping kittens. "Under the rock that looks like a baby's head?" Sarah ventured, and then pointed to a stone that had broken and resealed itself with moss in a shape that would have made her laugh on almost any other day. Mabel nodded as if that were a sensible suggestion. Evan got on his knees and used his hands like a guy on a beach building something out of sand because his kids asked him to. He pried at the stone. It moved, slow, heavy, and then rolled aside with a sigh. Underneath, wet earth. He dug, and his fingers hit metal, something round and lips sealed like a lid. They lifted it together, mud sucking at it like a toddler refusing a nap. It was a tin, the kind used to hold biscuits or flour in a kitchen 100 years ago. It was sealed with wax, mottled like old skin. The wax had a handprint in it. 4 fingers and a thumb, small and strong. Slim. A woman's. Sarah's heart threw up a hand inside her chest like a kid at a blackboard who knows the answer. They brought it back to the cabin and set it on the table. The cabin was warmer now, the fire in the wood stove making the air smell like toast. Sarah warmed the blade of a butter knife and slid it under the edge of the wax. It lifted with a sound like gum peeling off pavement, changed by time into something else. The lid came off. Inside were things that had not seen light in a century and looked like they had been waiting. Papers, folded small, edged with a brown that was not rot, but the patina of a near century of oxygen. A ribbon tied in a simple knot. A locket, gold and dull as a squash blossom dropped in the flower. And beneath, wrapped in cloth and tied like a present, a bundle of pages written in an impatient hand that was not Eleanor's. Evan lifted the first page with the care of a person opening a letter from a dead person to the living and read. "July 1922, he said quietly. "Miss Whitcomb, Eleanor, this does not right a wrong, but it will put words to a thing others will pretend did not exist. I cannot live with the weight of it on my chest. Silas Holloway is a thief. He is also a man who will live in a large house with a full table until his dying day, because he knows how to make friends and to whom to give money. He forged your husband's name on a paper he could not read, because I told him I could make the law say what he wanted. I did this. I did this with both hands, and the stupid belief that what a man with power wants, he gets, because wanting it earns him the right. You know now. I think you knew when you looked at me. You did not spit on me, though you should have. I am not trying to make you a deal. I am not trying to ask your forgiveness. I am telling you this because I am a coward, And I also, I think, want to be a better man. Attached are copies. Keep them where iron sings and the women talk. The signature bled in an elegant, shaking line. Jonathan Cole. Evan sat back like the word had slapped him. His mouth had drained of color. "Cole?" Sarah asked, her voice tight, her mind beginning to run ahead and bumping into something hard. Evan breathed out. He closed his eyes, opened them. Jonathan Cole in that era would be my great-grandfather. They looked at the small pile of pages. Sarah's belly seemed to gather itself tighter, as if wrapping itself around the baby. She put a hand there automatically. Mabel pressed her lips into an impressed line and nodded once, slowly, as if something she had long suspected was earning its graduation. "Looks like your people were bastards and also human beings," Mabel said to him. "You here now, though." He laughed, short and sharp. "I left town for a reason," he said, and then began to laugh in that way that is almost a cry, and stopped when he couldn't find a reason to keep making the sound. "I came back to look after my dad, who's dying, and who will never forgive me for not becoming a prosecutor like he wanted. He wanted me to put bad people in jail. He gestured to the pages. I wanted, I guess, to try to help the messes the good people left behind." "You will," Mabel said. "If you want to prove you are not your great-grandfather, this will do it. Or maybe it will prove you are, just the part that decided to try to be better. Different parts of ourselves run through families, same as blue eyes or a taste for whiskey. Pick the ones you feed." They read. The documents were copies of deeds and ledger entries, the ink a little blurrier, the strides of the letters a little lazier. Things written in a hurry, perhaps. One deed showed a signature Knowlton, no, Alton Whitcomb, shaky on a line that had afterward been improved. The improvement was faint but visible. You didn't have to be a handwriting analyst to see the second tail added to the T, the flourish on the B, that had not been present in the preceding names of his. There was a notarized page with the wrong date. Those things were not the smoking gun. They were the powder on the man's sleeve. "These are enough to make noise," Evan said, eyes bright in a new way. "They're not enough to win. But the letter, that's confession. It's also hearsay. The copies of the ledger entries are more—" He went quiet and swallowed. "I need the originals." "The journal said there were torn pages," Sarah said, flipping through, wishing the paper would just, by its old magic, heal itself in her hands. Pages she removed. "The map suggests there are 3 places," Mabel said, tapping the cedar branch shape, the dot, the X. "We found one, 2 to go." The baby turned again, and Sarah paused to lean against the table until the world remembered she was the part of it that mattered. "We have 30 days, she said. "They will come sooner," Mabel said. "You made a little noise by breathing. Somebody always hears noise." The next morning, a truck rolled slowly down the dirt road, and a man in sunglasses stepped out with a clipboard and the false casualness of a man in uniform without the uniform on his chest. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, glancing openly at her belly with a mix of pity and calculation, "I'm here to give you notice the auction date will be posted." "That looks like posting to me," Mabel said, appearing like an owl out of nowhere from the far side of the porch. She had a mug with steam in it, and the look on her face that said she wasn't intimidated by anybody who wrote their name with connected letters. Behind the man, a black SUV idled. A second man got out. He was about 50, tanned the way you get when you are outside but your hands do not do the labor, and a windbreaker with a logo over the pocket, North Star Woodland Holdings. He had a smile like winter sun, bright and cold. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice smooth enough to butter a biscuit. "Derek Holloway, Just happened to be in the area today, thought I'd come introduce myself. Beautiful piece of land, shame about the taxes. Sarah did not like the way he said her name. It's a home, she said. It could be a lot of things, he answered. The county needs the revenue. I have a proposition, and I think you're going to like it. He pulled a folded check from inside his jacket as if he were pulling a rabbit out of a hat. $50,000. Cashier's check. Give me a quit claim. I'll reimburse your moving expenses. Make sure you're set up somewhere warmer, somewhere close to a hospital. I'll make that call this afternoon. You can be back in town tonight. Mabel made a sound like a crow. Evan, who had driven up on the tail of the first truck, stiffened. Sarah's mind did a quick math that came with the speed of panic. 50,000 would make her whole. It would pay the debt. It would leave enough for the baby's first year of diapers and a new set of tires and maybe a patient therapist who would call her back. It would also mean the cabin would be an empty square in the woods with fresh stumps around it, then a gate with a chain and a sign that said, in nice font, "No trespassing." It would mean the journal would be a story without an ending. It would mean something in her spine that had made itself into iron since yesterday would have been a waste. No, she heard herself say, and surprised herself with the steadiness of the word. No, thank you. Derek's eyes didn't register surprise. They registered the filing of a different form of negotiation. You might want to think about what's good for your child, he said pleasantly. I am, Sarah said softly. This is going to be very unpleasant for you, he advised, because advice sounds compassionate. You can't fight the county. No, Evan said, and his voice had the tone it got when he stood up in court, the one he sometimes forgot because he hadn't had to use it in a while. But we can ask the county to wait, and if we get a judge to sign an injunction based on a contested title, the county will prefer it because it means they won't have to unwind a sale later. Saves taxpayers money. You could tell your board you saved them the trouble. Derek smiled like he was thinking about biting something. Mr. Cole, he said smoothly, your granddad did good work for us. Yeah, Evan said, and did not smile back. He's dead. Derek's eyes sharpened. He tucked the check away as if it had been part of a trick they weren't interested in enjoying. We'll be talking, he said, and turned. The checkpoint man tapped the notice to the door with blue tape. It fluttered like a cheap flag. The SUV pulled away, soft on the dirt, the smell of clean exhaust mixing with the sweet and rot of the apples. He's going to be a problem, Evan said. That right there is a person who thinks he only loses when he's not trying, Mabel said, and sipped her coffee. But he's just a man. You've just got to get in the habit of reminding yourself of that. Even men who can take things are just men. They went to find the next cache on the map. The lantern woman waited on the ridge, a pile of rock shaped by the accidents of time and the wishful seeing of humans into something like a figure with a skirt and a handle, if you stood to the right of it and closed one eye. The land around it had changed in a century, but not as much as a city would have. The forest had a way of smoothing scars into something that looked like life if you didn't look too closely. The ground was sparsely covered with grass that smelled like summer when you stepped on it and made the sound of crushed paper when you didn't. They looked under, around, between the rocks, as carefully as if snakes were suggestions instead of animals. Evan found a piece of glass worn soft by time like sea glass, and Sarah found a horseshoe, 3 nails still stuck in it, a rumor of good fortune. Mabel tapped a rock that made a hollow sound and crouched, her bones cracking their disapproval. Hear that? Evan tipped the rock. A cavity beneath, small. A tin again, this one a tobacco can flat as a biscuit, with a lid crimped down. He pried gently. Inside, a piece of paper rolled into a tight cylinder and a ring of something green that had once been twine. He slid the paper out. It was not a document, it was a scrap of something that looked like a page torn from a ledger but was actually something more like poetry. It was a key, it was a list. Sky tells the way, it said. Night tells the number. And under that, a row of tiny ink dots that matched the pattern of constellations if you squinted and knew how to squint. Above it, faint, a word that looked like north. At the bottom, a sentence. Under the mother's heart, inside where the world was quiet. That's a riddle you write when you think you're going to love whoever comes next, Mabel said, her voice suddenly soft. Night tells the number, that'll be stars. That dot pattern is probably a map. You put the sky on the land and you go where the brightest is, the mother's heart, where the world was quiet. She put a hand on her own chest, like the old muscle there remembered a baby once. That's gotta be, somewhere you can get inside, the oak with the hollow. The cedar that was lightning-struck became a nurse log where everything grew. These woods are full of mothers. We'll find the one. They returned to the cabin at dusk, tired and excited, and the kind of dirty that made you want to shower for a week and has its own kind of satisfaction. A note flapped on the door. Water. Fixed. You owe me pie. Jake. Under it, an arrow pointing to the faucet. It ran when Sarah turned it, blessedly, the sound of water in a quiet house like a friend arriving at your door. The joy of it was ridiculous, and it made her laugh, which made her cry, which made her laugh again. Mabel looked at her like the younger you look at anybody who is having the first of anything. Eat, Mabel said, and opened the cinnamon tin. Feed yourself and feed that baby. You can do all kinds of things hungry, but you do them better with bread in you. They did not have long. The next morning, a sheriff's deputy, big and not unkind in a way that reminded Sarah of her gym teacher in 7th grade, arrived to deliver the official notice she would have to put with the journal on the table. He leaned in with the English teacher tone that cops use when they want you to like them. I'm sorry, he said to Sarah, not sounding sorry so much as rehearsed. You have 27 days. We'll see you in court, Evan said pleasantly, and the deputy gave him a look that said he, too, had a story with that room. They went searching for the mother. It was easier than the last time because it fit in them now, not like a puzzle, but like something inevitable, the way you find your way back to your old house with your eyes closed. They walked south from the cabin where the slope dipped into a small bowl where the ferns gathered, and Sarah saw it first. A cedar that had been struck once and lived anyway, its top gone and its center hollowed, a natural alcove big enough for a small child to hide in and pretend it was a house. The inside smelled like rich, sharp sap and something sweet that reminded her of the cedar chest at the foot of her grandmother's bed. It was cool in there, even when the world was hot, a mother's heart indeed. Here? She asked, because she wanted it to be true. Mabel smiled like a coyote about to tell a joke, and lifted her chin where a small mark had been carved into the inside of the tree, a symbol so subtle it would have meant nothing if you hadn't been looking. It was a W. Whitcomb. Evan bent and ran his hand under a lip of bark and extracted a bundle of oilcloth. Inside, pages, tied with white thread, in the elegant hand of Eleanor Whitcomb, and the careless confession of Jonathan Cole. And a deed, an original deed, brittle and old, with a language as old-fashioned as a dress with a high collar. A deed granting property to Eleanor Whitcomb with a reservation to her heirs, and assigns, and a clause that made Sarah's mouth shape without sound. The clause set aside a conservation trust, words that hadn't been used in that way in 1920s Oregon, but meant the same thing. To keep the grove of cedar trees her husband loved free from use and available for the use of mothers who find themselves in need. A trust, Evan breathed, and his eyes almost glowed with the thrill of a lawyer finding a toy in a sandbox. A trust is complicated because a trust is also simple. It is a box you put something in for the benefit of someone else. You need a trustee. The trustee listed here is, he squinted, Providence Bank, which doesn't exist anymore because it was a small-town bank that got swallowed when my father was in his 20s. But trust law is sticky. The bank's obligations transfer when the bank is bought. We find the successor. It's probably Western Reserve, and then to Cascadia Financial. This could be viable. This could be real. The baby shifted, and Sarah suddenly realized how long it had been since she'd been to the bathroom, that she was thirsty, that her back ached in a way that made her think of stacked books leaning. She smiled anyway, because her teeth had been clenched for months, and they knew how to be in the air again. So, we have proof? Enough to file. Enough to ask for relief, enough to scare Derek Holloway. He tucked the documents into a plastic sleeve he'd brought from his satchel like he'd always known this was coming. His hands were gentle. I will go to my office and put the wheels on this. I'll see a judge and try to get an emergency order delaying the auction. If the trust exists, if we can find the successor bank, we can ask for an accounting. If they've failed to administer it, which, given this is 100 years old, they likely have, we can ask for damages and fees. And his tone changed, a note of concern. We need to be careful. The Holloways will move. They may try to take, Mabel said. They are good at taking. They took copies of everything. They put the originals back in the wooden box for now, in the floor, beneath the bell, back where Iron could sing over them. And then Sarah watched as Evan drove off down the dirt, the taillights winking like promises. Mabel's face folded with thought. I'm going to go get my cousin, she said. He's got a long memory and a shovel. He'll sit on your porch and watch. Do I need a guard? Sarah asked, half joking and half not. You need to not be alone, Mabel said. There are a lot of ways to not be alone. If you feel scared, call me. If your phone doesn't call, yell. Sound carries in these woods. The wind shifted and brought the scent of rain. The tree's language changed. Sarah stood in her doorway and felt for the first time the cabin shift from empty to defensive. A little like a mother who stood in a doorway and did not let anybody come inside with shoes on. That night, rain tapped the tin roof like an old friend asking to be let in. It soothed and it woke. At 2 a.m, a light swept across the window, a car where no car should be. She sat up, heart loud. Mabel had promised a cousin. Maybe it was him. But the light moved like someone doesn't move when they're thinking about other people. It circled the cabin, slow, steady. A thud sounded, and then the ping of something metal hitting stone. Sarah's mouth dried. She stood with the weight distribution of the woman who will run if she must, but would like to not. Something hit the window, small, hard. She slid her fingers to the curtain and peered through. 2 men, their backs to the window, heads turned toward each other as they did something at the door. One had a tattoo on his neck the size and shape of a continent. She swallowed, quietly. The baby kicked, a sharp little protest. Sarah whispered, I know. She reached for the bell. She lifted it and brought it down with deliberate force. It rang like it had been making quiet sounds for 100 years and waiting to be loud. It was not magic, and it was. One of the men whipped his head up, the other turned. They stared at the door like it had teeth. One of them laughed, short, the other did not. A light flashed, bright, from the trees beyond the driveway. A voice came, old and busted and very loud. I got a phone in my hand and a double barrel behind me. Mabel yelled, like she was in a better world with better neighbors. You want to see which one gets here faster, be my guest. Another light bobbed up behind her. 2 more points of light. Men's shapes. Mabel's cousin and his boys, apparently called out of bed by nothing more than an old woman's sense of, "You should probably get dressed and go over there." The 2 at the door melted into the night in a way that meant they had practice, their tires whispering on the wet road a long moment later. "I told you sound carries," Mabel said the next day, bringing coffee that somehow tasted like cloves and a casserole in a dish with daisies. "Sometimes you've got to be loud." "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning for the casserole and the noise, and the way the fear in her ribcage had a way to get out through her mouth and become laughter instead. "It's getting worse." "It's getting close to the end," Mabel corrected. "Men like Derek think the negotiation starts when they say it does. He's wrong. It started 100 years ago. He just forgot whose move it is now." The next week passed like a montage if you watched it from the outside. Days cut into nights, cut into mornings, paperwork and waiting, and small domestic miracles layered over the sense of impending collision. Jake, the neighbor boy, fixed the sink for real and taught Sarah how to bleed the air out of the pipes, water running clear and cold, in a way that felt like a blessing from a god she believed in when wood smoke made the house smell like peace. Mabel taught Sarah how to make bread that rose slow and true, and when it came out of the oven they sliced it and ate it with butter, and for a moment the house felt like it had never been empty. Birds came to the feeder hung on a nail under the eave, their hunger small and insistent, while the human hunger took up the bigger space. Sarah dreamed of her grandmother sitting at this table and writing letters in slow, careful script. She dreamed of a young woman in a dress made for a different kind of work, putting a journal in a cedar box and closing it with a piece of ribbon that had once tied back her hair. Evan called from town when he had service. He had found the successor bank, then the successor to the successor. The old trust had been swallowed so many times the original shape had been lost. The bank had failed to administer it because it had been lost. The law might call that a breach of fiduciary duty. They could ask for an accounting, and when a bank couldn't show one, they sometimes paid to make the problem go away. Paid to the trust. That money could pay taxes. It could keep the trust's purpose alive. "If we can stop the auction, we have time," Evan said. "If we have time, we can make the bank find the records. If they don't find them, we can ask for damages. If the court awards them, you can breathe." He would drive back at dusk with papers. They would sit at the table with pens while Mabel knitted something that started as a rectangle and decided to be a square and felt like magic simply because the woman's hands making it had years in them. "You all are the best part of my day," Evan said once, half a joke and half not. Sarah told him about the baby's latest rhythms. She couldn't help it. She thought of the way his jaw softened when he listened, like his face had old practice with tenderness that had gone unused. He told her about his father refusing chemo because he said he wanted to die with the hair he had left. He told her about the guilt that comes when you leave and the guilt that comes when you stay. They overlapped in some places. He laughed at himself and then stopped because you don't always laugh at yourself when you're tired. One afternoon, a woman with a careful haircut and a clipboard arrived to take pictures, her camera lens like a little opinionated eye. "Insurance," she explained. "The county wants a record in case the place falls down before auction." She made a note when she saw the handmade sign Mabel had propped against the door. "Contested title. Court hearing pending." She made a bigger note when she saw a group of men with orange vests on the property line on the far edge, measuring and marking like they owned the future. "Who are they?" she asked, as if the question and the answer were either of their business. "Surveyors," Mabel said, "hired by people who think measuring is the same thing as owning." That night, wind came up. The baby turned and then went very quiet. Sarah lay in bed with both hands on her belly, waiting for the small fish to jump, the little roll that meant, "I am still here, and I am still mine." The moon came and hid and came again. She spoke to the baby under her breath. "Kick for me." Nothing. "I know you're sleeping," she whispered. "It's okay. Don't need you to perform like me. I just need to know you're okay." Morning came, thin and pale, and stillness where movement had been. She swallowed and stood slowly, and dressed in something that could come off quickly if she needed a doctor to do what doctors do and walk down the path to Mabel's, her heart beat like a drum too far away. Mabel took one look at her face and fished the car keys out of a bowl. "We're going," she said. "And don't you shake at me like I'm a leaf. You're fine, she's fine, but you're not going to prove me right standing here." The clinic was small and kind. The nurse, in her 50s, with hair she had stopped coloring because the world had bigger problems, put Sarah on the monitor and patted her knee. The machine hummed like an old refrigerator. The paper chart rolled off the side like a tongue. The baby's heartbeat came on suddenly, loud, oceanic, outrageous, the sound of life in a world that often pretended otherwise. Sarah cried in relief. The nurse's smile was the sort that answers prayers it does not believe in. She was tucked, she said. She moved on her own schedule. Sound familiar? Back at the cabin that afternoon, the rain did not stop. When they opened the door to the stove to feed it, steam billowed like breath. The baby rolled and rolled, as if to make up for having been quiet, and Sarah lay her hand there again and again, greedy for each movement. When Evan walked in, cold and wet and carrying a folder inside his coat, he saw the look on her face, and his own changed, softer and more open than she had seen it. "Okay, okay," she said, and then, because okay is a lie and a truth at the same time, added, "Now." "I got the injunction," he said, and his voice was steady, but his hand shook when it reached for the stove, and then pulled back because it was not his house. "The judge signed it based on the documents we showed in the age of the trust. We stopped the auction." He let out a breath the way you do after you've been under, and you see the surface and you are not sure until you break it. "We bought time." She laughed and cried at once, automatic, involuntary. Mabel smiled like she had wanted a story to go this way and was not surprised when it did. The next day, Derek Holloway came in person. He came because the kind of person he was did not like to be told no, and then to be told by a judge to come back another day. He brought a lawyer in a suit that looked like it had been printed on him, and he brought the kind of anger that people mistake for conviction. He stood on the porch and looked at the posted injunction like you might look at a crooked picture you cannot straighten because it belongs to someone else. "You realize," he said, "you're making a mistake you can't fix. You think a piece of paper from 100 years ago means the same thing as a piece of paper from yesterday," Evan said. "It's called the law. You make your money off it. Heirs and assigns, injunctive relief, fiduciary duty. Big words like yours, like big toys. We brought our own." Derek looked at him like he had forgotten which man was supposed to be the one with the upper hand. "Do your family proud, Mr. Cole. Walk away." Evan's face tightened as if a nerve in it had been hit. "I am," he said simply. The wind climbed that afternoon, and then a high thin edge slid into it that made Mabel look at the sky and say quietly, "It's going to be bad." She had a particular way of staring at the horizon, like she was listening to an old radio show that told you what was coming if you knew how to understand it. They battened. They wedged the shutters. Jake came and nailed loose things down. They brought in wood like they expected company. They filled pots with water. Sarah tried not to think about what she would do if she went into labor and the roads washed out. She told herself she had time. She did math with the weeks. Night came early, and with it rain that pounded like it had been waiting to do so all summer. The creek rose, the spring muttered. The cabin stood and shivered. Somewhere, a tree gave way with a crack like a bone. The light flickered when the wind tested the lines and then didn't come back. The cabin returned to its default setting, dark and old and not unwilling. Evan sat at the table with a battery lantern between them and spread the documents in a neat fan like a magician showing how the trick is done. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll go to Cascadia Financial. I have an appointment with the trust department. They will either know what this is or pretend they don't. If they don't, we can file anyway. In the meantime," he looked at the stack, "you know there's a third stash." "The widow's lantern was one," Mabel said. "The mother's heart, another. The iron singing. Yes, that was the spring pump. But the journal mentions the place where the iron sings in winter," Sarah said. "In winter. The pump sings all year, the stove." She looked at the iron belly of the wood stove that had been keeping them warm, and saw for the first time the small dent on its left side, as if someone had knocked something against it hard and long ago. She crouched slowly, her belly in the way, and ran her fingers along the side. There, in the pattern of casting, an oddity, a small circle that was not a design, but meaning. "Lower," Mabel said, sinking onto her knees with surprisingly fluid grace for someone her age. Her fingers went under the lip where the ash pan sat. She pulled the pan out, the old ash falling like gray silk onto the hearthstone. Behind the space, a seam. Sarah's hands fit into the cold narrowness and pressed. Something gave. A small panel fell away inside with a metallic sigh. She reached and felt her fingers close around a parcel, cloth-wrapped and warm from the iron's belly. She pulled it out, heart wild. Inside were the torn pages from the journal, entries that had been missing, pieces that made a puzzle a picture. And one more item, a tiny cloth bag that clinked. She opened it, and the sound, when it came, was like 1,000 small bells. Inside were gold coins, a tidy number, dull and bright at once, each stamped with a year that made Sarah think of men with beards and newsboys with caps they wore sideways like heaven meant it. It was not a fortune. It was enough to make a month turn into grace. And with it, a note. "I cannot make a bank honor what they do not find," Eleanor had written, her hand crabby with exhaustion and anger and hope. "But I can leave my child with the money to go into town and say no for a little while, and yes to what she needs. If you are not my child, you are someone else's. Use it in honor. Use it to get what cannot be bought." Sarah cried in a way that made the baby squirm, as if she wanted to get closer to the sound. Mabel put a hand on her shoulder, then her belly, and then back to her shoulder in a practiced little dance. "She thought of you before you knew you existed," Mabel said, and then added quietly, "They all do, I think. The women." The storm howled. Somewhere, a tree went down. On the ridge, a glow like moonlight moved where no moon could be. Evan stood, went to the window, and froze. "They're back," he said quietly. "Not the kind of fear you shout. 2 points of light, 2 men, the same 2. It was hard to tell. Shadows make faces into masks. They were moving toward the porch with purpose and plastic in their hands. Gas cans. The sour chemical smell rose even under the sap and the smoke. "Not tonight," Mabel said to the air and the men both. "Not for a baby and a woman with a heartbeat like that." She moved with the speed of a young person suddenly inside her body. She pulled the shotgun from behind the wood box with the ease of someone who kept it where other people put umbrellas. Evan took off his tie like it might be used against him and rolled up his sleeves. Sarah breathed in and out, checking in with her body, asking it if it could do this and be okay. It told her yes, and all at once, no, because her belly tightened hard enough to make her fold. Once, halfway, her breath leaving her like a sigh. Not now, she told the muscles that had been practicing for months. Not yet, not now. They threw the gas. It splashed across the edge of the porch and the door with a horrible joy. A match flared, the moment bright as a thought, and then the porch lit. The wood screamed. Evan had the fire extinguisher in his hand before Sarah had time to wonder if they had one. He pulled the pin, aimed, and the white foam covered the flame in a lovely hiss, like steam from a kettle, and the fire choked, then crawled into the corner where it ate a board before being smothered by more foam. The smell turned from bright, chemical, to the stink of wet ash. Mabel fired one warning shot into the air. The men ducked and bolted. She fired again, lower, not to hit but to say, "I meant it." A light came on across the ridge. Jake's, then another, like a string of Christmas lights. Voices, cars, sound carries. Sarah's belly seized again. She gripped the edge of the table with both hands, and this time could not make the noise in her throat stay in. "It hurts," she said, and then laughed at herself for the obviousness of it, and then did not laugh because it hurt more. "How far apart?" Mabel asked, with the focus of the nurse she had not been but could have been. I don't know," Sarah said. "I'm not counting correctly." She didn't want to do this right now, didn't want the baby to arrive in smoke and fear, wanted quiet and a playlist and a tub of water and a hand to hold that was not this wild fear's hand. Fate has a terrible ear for requests. "We need to go," Evan said, already moving, field general. "Road's sloppy but not washed out. We can do it. Jake can clear the down branch by the bridge if he has to. Mabel, call ahead. Tell them we need a room and a warm thing and someone who hasn't slept because they've been waiting for us." Mabel nodded, already on the phone, her voice the kind that makes machines listen. Sarah took a step and then another, and the world narrowed to a hallway with pain on one side and fear on the other, and the baby in the center, miraculous and stubborn, like herself. They got her into the car with people holding umbrellas and language that sounded like prayers without being. The storm pushed them from the side like it wanted to keep them back, but the car pushed into it. The baby knocked like a fist at a door you have to open in your own house, even when the house is on fire outside. They made it. Of course they did. The story we tell our children has to hold that the world sometimes breaks in our favor. The nurse who had rolled her eyes kindly at Sarah's earlier panic was there. The doctor was younger than Sarah wanted and older than you think. At 37, he had the air of someone who had been around long enough to be confident and not long enough to be cynical. He smiled at Mabel and nodded at Evan like you do when you know the map of a place includes the people. "Good to see you again," he said to them both and then to Sarah. "Good to see you for the first time." The labor was the kind that men imagine is a romantic trial, and women know is a doubled reality, both more and less than anyone can put words to. It was a long time or a short one, depending on where you stand now to watch it. Sarah said words she didn't know she knew. She put her palm against the window in the hospital room where the rain made the world into a smeared watercolor and thought of the cedar tree and the cavity inside like a heart. She thought of the journal and the woman who wrote, "We will find the place we are all trying to go." She thought of her grandmother stirring soup at a stove that was now hers. She thought of Derek's face and his smugness and let it turn into fuel and then into ash like all bad things eventually do. And the baby arrived just after dawn when the storm had run out of fury and the world wanted to pretend it had not tried to knock everything down. She was pink and furious and tiny, and the size of every hope Sarah had ever had compressed into a shape with lungs and fingers. She cried like she had opinions that would make the county board blush. They laid her on Sarah's chest, and the world went both huge and very small, a circle no bigger than a mother's body and a child's breath. There are moments that make everything else a prologue. This was one. "What will you name her?" Mabel asked later, in a voice that had gotten itself under control while she sat with her hands folded and a look on her face like prayer. "Eleanor," Sarah said, without hesitation. "For the woman who left me the road, for my own woman, for the pieces of us that knew we would find each other if we just kept walking." She looked up at Evan, who was sitting in the chair doing the thing men get to do when their hands are not required, looking reverent and useless and then finding uses anyway. "Eleanor Mabel Parker," she amended, and Mabel's mouth did a thing that looked like a laugh, and a sob came and she raised a hand quickly to swat it away like a fly that was love. 2 days later, with the injunction filing proceeding and the storm cleaning up after itself the way storms expect women to, Sarah brought Eleanor home to the cabin that had held secrets, fear, a little fire, and the kind of hope that is the color of new leaves. The porch had been patched. The window had been replaced. The blue tape of the county notice, dated and menacing, looked like a dreary joke now that it had a friend in the injunction pinned beside it with a paperclip. The cabin was no longer empty, which is something you can feel like you feel heat from a stove. Evan met them there with flowers that looked like they had been chosen by someone unused to choosing flowers. Bright, mismatched, perfect. He had a look on his face like a man who had done something. Not the thing, but a thing, and hoped it would add up to enough. Cascadia Financial pretended to not know about the trust, he said, greeting them with the news like bread he had baked himself. They pretended not to have seen the name Whitcomb. Then I told them we had the court order and the original deed and the letter, and that we would be happy to file for damages if their records had been mislaid. They told me to wait in the lobby. Then they found a box. A box. The word made Sarah's stomach flip because the world had turned that noun into miracle. What kind of box? A banker's box full of paper. It had been misfiled in 1964. It had the trust documents. It had ledger entries showing that a small sum had been deposited annually by a logging operation that used the stream at the bottom of the property to float logs for 15 years. It had invoices and withdrawals, and then nothing, because the bank changed hands and someone didn't transfer it. There's $5,000 in it right now, which is not much, but with interest and penalties for failing to administer a trust and attorney's fees. He smiled with the satisfaction of a nice man being allowed a little aggression. They made an offer. "How much?" Sarah asked, both feet braced like she might fall. $220,000. The number made a sound in the air. Mabel did the math aloud like she was counting stitches. Taxes paid, back taxes paid, lawyer paid, diapers for the next... She stopped because she was crying, angrily, without wanting to. You don't say those numbers in old kitchens. It wasn't enough, Evan said, and they both looked at him as if he had said, I have decided to become a professional liar. He held up his hands, pacifying. I didn't say no, I said we want recognition. They were the successor trustees to a trust that was for mothers. 100 years ago, Eleanor wrote that she wanted this place to be a sanctuary. So, we asked for something else too, not just money. He went to the table and set down a fat envelope, then opened it, and pulled out papers that bore the printed names of banks and the signatures of people who had pens and were used to using them. We asked for, and the court approved, the establishment of a new trust under the old one's name. The E. Whitcomb Grove Trust. It owns the acre around the spring and the cedar grove, and a path that leads to it. No one can sell it. No one can log it. It exists for this. Mothers in need may use it. It will be maintained by a small endowment. You are the trustee. Mabel is the advisor. The bank writes the checks. No one can paper it over again." He looked up, his face careful. "We also ask the county to abate your taxes for the last year based on hardship and the nature of the trust law." They did. "We use the money from the bank to pay the rest and to repair the porch and the window and start a fund for keeping this place running. We set some aside for whatever you want to start here, and—" He hesitated, because here came the thing he was not sure he could say without making everything he had done look like merely in service of his own absolution. "My father. He has my great-grandfather's old papers, in a box. We found a letter the day you delivered Eleanor. It was from Jonathan Cole to Silas Holloway. It is, in a legal sense, nothing. It is also exactly what it feels like, an admission of guilt. The envelope was never opened. It was addressed and stored. It never got sent. It was maybe a prayer he wrote and never said. It's the thing that made me. No, I am not imagining that sometimes men change their minds, not because they're heroes, because someone keeps the pressure on." He handed it to her. The paper was brittle, but the words were clear. The angry part of her that had thought about trumpets when victory came softened a little. Sarah sat down because she could not trust her legs. She looked at her baby, whose face was the same as it had been 2 hours ago, which is to say the most beautiful face in the world, and then at the papers, which were the opposite of a baby, and now looked like they might be a thing you could love anyway. "We won," she said quietly, and felt in her mouth the old metallic taste of adrenaline and the new taste of something sweet and hard-earned. "We did this part," Mabel said. "There will be other parts. Men like Derek are a season. They will come again, and you will stand again. But for now—" She touched the wooden rocker in the corner by the fire that Jake had repaired and sanded, so its splinters would not hurt small hands. "Rock your girl, and think about the women who made this possible by doing the thing they could do when they could do it." That night, the cabin was quieter than it had been in Sarah's lifetime, perhaps. Wind soft, the stove purring, the rain cosmetic. She sat in the old rocker with Eleanor against her chest, the baby's breath making the small wet sound that makes a house into a home. The journal lay on the table beside them, open to a page where Eleanor Whitcomb had drawn a sketch of the cedar tree with a heart inside like the trunk was a torso. The sketch had a note beside it. "If you listen to old wood, you will hear your own life talking to you." Evan sat opposite, not touching them, because he was careful, because the air in the room was holy and he knew it. He would go home tonight to his dying father and sit by his bed and say nothing because there won't be enough. He looked at Sarah and then away, in the way of a person who has learned what not to ask for and is learning maybe to ask anyway. The question hung in the air between them and took no answers yet. In the days that followed, letters arrived instead of threats. The bank's envelope had a check in it, clean and ridiculous with numbers. The county clerk sent a form with receipts stapled to it. A local reporter called because Mabel told her to, and she came with a notepad and the kind of curiosity that is often the beginning of change. They took a picture of Sarah under the cedar, her child asleep in a sling. Evan standing slightly apart because he understood that this was not his to center. Mabel with her hand on the tree like it was her daughter's shoulder. The story ran in the Sunday paper, and old women read it at breakfast and sighed, and young people read it and rolled their eyes, and then clipped it to put on their fridges. Something else shifted too, something not legal and not public. Letters came addressed to the Trust. They were in handwriting so round you could almost see the faces that went with them. "My name is Tara, and I have 2 kids and I don't know where else to go, and I saw the paper." My name is Noelle, and I left last night and I can't go home. My name is Jessica, and I lost my job and I need a week where no one is yelling at me and my baby. Sarah and Mabel read them and cried and made lists. They made beds. They kept the woodpile full. They hung a curtain in the second room and called it a guest room with a straight face, because they knew that is sometimes the difference between shame and okay. Women came, not all the time, not like a flood. They came one by one, because change is by its nature small and by its effect enormous. A woman named Kim stood by the spring and put her hands in the water and said, "I haven't been quiet in 6 months." A woman named Elena came with twins and fell asleep on the porch with one on her chest, and Sarah sat and did nothing, because doing nothing was what you did when the thing you were doing mattered. A woman named Rose stood by the cedar and crossed herself and said, "My grandmother told me this was here. She said if I needed a place, there would be a place, and I thought she was telling fairy stories." And Sarah said she was, and they both laughed. Sarah's own days arranged themselves around feedings and naps and phone calls to the bank, and the trust meetings with Mabel at the table where they fought old enemies, confusion, bureaucratic inertia, with pens. Her body healed. Her mind remembered how to sleep for 3 hours in a row and feel like a queen. She kept the journal beside her like an elder, and sometimes opened to a page at random and read something, and found that it talked to her in a way that made her feel she had been the one writing it, not reading. One afternoon, months later, when the leaves had turned into coins and the air smelled like the part of summer that hadn't spent itself, a package arrived. It was from a law office in town, and within was a letter. "Miss Parker," it began, "this was found among the effects of Mrs. June Parker after her death." It was labeled, "For the girl who will need it. Any girl, my girl." We did not know who that meant until we read the paper. If this is not yours, forgive me. If it is, you will know. Inside was a small envelope with Sarah's name in her grandmother's careful hand. Inside that, a folded piece of paper and a key. The paper was a family tree. The key was small and iron and old. The tree showed what Mabel had not said, and what Sarah might not have wanted to know yet. Eleanor Whitcomb had had a daughter. Her name was Rose. Rose had been adopted by a family called Parker. Rose had later had children, among them June, who had married a man named Parker, who had not been much good. June had never known her own mother's name, or if she had been told to keep it to herself. The line ran straight from Rose to June to Sarah. The tree made official what the cabin had already decided. Her blood had remembered before paper did. One evening, when the sky was that purple you cannot make in paint, Mabel came to the cabin with her braid unbraided for the first time and a tremble in her hands. "I have something to tell you, and I have delayed and delayed, because old people like to take their secrets with them, and I decided I am tired of being that kind of old person," she said, sitting before being asked because she was too nervous to do otherwise. "My mother was a Whitcomb. My Aunt Rose was your grandmother June's mother. She had your mother when she was very young, and the world was the kind of unkind that does not make good mothers better. Your grandmother did not know, and then she knew, and then she did not want to know. And then she wrote me and told me to keep my mouth shut until there was a reason. I decided this was a reason, my dear." Sarah did math in her head that made it necessary to put her hands on the table and breathe. "You're my what?" "Cousin," Mabel said, and then laughed in a way that sounded like a sigh. "Great cousin. I don't know. The point is, family. If I had had a crystal ball, I would have said it sooner, but the world doesn't give me balls of any kind anymore. It gives me this. This is better." Sarah stood and moved to her and hugged her and felt her rib bones under the cardigan and also strength like boards under the skin. She thought of the way people will sometimes say, "It all makes sense now," and felt how untrue and true that is. It didn't make sense. It made something better. You could call it meaning, or you could call it home. "I thought that was the secret to save for the end," Mabel said later, her voice casual and her eyes running. "But there is another." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a locket. Sarah knew it before she saw it. The locket from the cedar box. "It was supposed to be a gift for you from the beginning. I took it because taking is what we did to survive. I kept it because I wanted to not forget. I give it to you because forgetting and remembering are both also gifts, and you have enough of both now." Sarah accepted it with both hands because she had learned. Inside was a lock of hair and a tiny drawing of a cedar, the center shaded like a heart. On the back, scratched in a hand that was not careful because it did not need to be, 2 letters, E.W. There were quiet days and busy ones. There were meetings with the bank when men in suits learned to sit and listen to women who did not try to use big words to sound important. There were quiet Saturday mornings when Evan brought muffins and held the baby and learned how to be steady with a body that is both weight and breath. There were kissing moments and not kissing moments. There were fights and then apologies, when he said, "I wanted to fix what my family broke," and she said, "You did not break it," and he said, "A man needs to know which of his ghosts he is wearing," and she said, "We're wearing ours together then." They did, slowly, carefully, the way people who have been hurt and healed and hurt again do it when they have decided to try something brave anyway. They built the trust's work from a kitchen table and a porch. They wrote rules that were not cruel. "The house is for rest," Sarah wrote at the top of the page in her own neat hand, and under it, for safety, and under that, for women to be believed. They did not ask for reasons. They asked if you wanted tea. They asked if you were hungry. They made lists of things that aren't on most lists. Extra toothbrushes, leafy greens, legal aid phone numbers. They did not insist on success stories, because they understood that sometimes the success is getting out of bed and breathing, and sometimes the success is bringing a baby home and making bread, and sometimes the success is not forgiving the man who hurt you because your body is not a courthouse and you do not owe anybody anything. Once, in the spring when everything has the audacity to be tender, a young woman about 19 came to them in the dusk, walking like a deer with a wound. Sarah opened the door before she knocked. The girl looked at her like she had read an old book and found herself in it. "I don't know where else to go," she said. "Good," Sarah said, and made her sit, and put a cup in her hands that made steam and meant the thing it meant. "You're here. That is everything. When they lost people, because you do in this kind of work, they did not tell themselves the old stories about their failure. They lit a candle and said the person's name aloud, like you do for the dead and then the living. They told each other jokes that made their bellies hurt on purpose. They sat under the cedar when the world felt too heavy and put their backs against its bark and let themselves be tiny. One day, Derek Holloway showed up again, without his lawyer, without his checkbook, as if he had realized that you cannot negotiate with a house that has made itself into love. He stood on the porch and put his hands in his pockets like he wanted to have something to do with them and said, badly, "Congratulations." He looked at the cedar grove like a tourist looks at a view. "It's a pretty place to be from." "I am from here," Sarah said simply. "You are too." He nodded once like he had been forced to read a line and got through it. "If you're looking for a donation," he said, and then stopped, because he heard how that sounded, and tried again. "If you need anything, I still have numbers that are good." "We have our own numbers," Mabel said from inside, not unkind. "Okay," he said, and turned. He hesitated, then looked back at Sarah. "You did what the men in my family couldn't be bothered to do," he said gruffly. "You listened to your dead." "And the living," she said. "We listen to them too." He nodded and left, and did not come again. His name stopped being a thing that made Sarah's shoulders tighten, and started being a thing that made her think, "We changed a tax map," which is, if you think about it, the most romantic thing anyone can say about a place. The baby grew like babies do, which is to say, in all the places you can see and the ones you cannot. Her hair smelled like the top of a warm loaf. Her hands opened and closed like flowers. She learned to smile like she had invented the gesture. She learned to laugh like she was breaking and building the world. Sarah held her as often as she could, and as often as she needed to. There were nights when the baby would not sleep, and Sarah could not write a single email, and the world felt like it would crumble with the weight of one more breath. And then there were mornings when the light came in green, and the coffee tasted like a second chance, and it added up, in that accounting we all do, to something like joy. Evan asked Sarah to marry him a year from the day she had arrived, under the cedar, with the red-winged blackbird flitting and the spring saying its constant small piece. He did not kneel because they agreed they were done with gestures that put someone above someone else. He held out a ring that had been in his family and had belonged to a woman he might have been proud to claim, and might not. He said, "If you want to not do this alone." And she said, "I already am not alone." And he said, "If you want to not do this alone with me." And she said yes before he had finished the sentence, because sometimes the future waits until you can name it. They had the kind of wedding that consists of a table and food and friends, and no speeches that last too long. Mabel wore a dress the color of winter sunlight, and told a story about Sarah's grandmother that made everybody think of cake and not sadness. Jake cried shamelessly, and then tried to pretend it was the wind. The bank sent a donation in a tiny envelope as if embarrassed by its own largesse, and Sarah opened it, then folded the paper back on itself like you do with origami to make a crane. People began to say the cabin like it was a person. Is the cabin still taking guests? Did the cabin get fixed after that storm? Does the cabin want tomatoes? The cabin saved my sister. The words felt right. The place had made itself into more than walls. It had made itself into a summons. Years from now, when someone asks Sarah about the beginning of it all, she will not talk about the county. She will not talk about the bank. She will not talk about the man with the check. She will say, "I was terrified and I came anyway. I was pregnant and I was so tired, and I climbed a porch that had rot in it and into my life. I found a journal in a floor, and it turned out the floor was the sky. The woman who wrote it taught me that if you have a thing to prove, you hide it in the kind of place men will not bend down to look, which is to say, inside a story in a mother's hands. I asked for help, and someone who did not owe me anything said yes, because they had a ledger of their own they were trying to balance. The men with power thought that if they made it rain, I would drown. I learned I am a cedar. I drink rain, I keep standing." On quiet nights, when the world was small and good, she would read from the journal to Eleanor, who liked to put her hand flat on the page like she could feel the woman's pulse there. "Hope can be found in forgotten places," Eleanor Whitcomb had written once, maybe on a day when she did not believe it and needed to see the word shaped. "Strength is forged in the face of despair." Sarah read that sentence to her daughter and let the words sit in the room long enough to change the temperature. "Before we sleep," Sarah would whisper on those nights to the girls who would come later, the ones with lost jobs and errant men and babies with loud lungs and no place to put them. "Tell me where you're from and what time it is there." Sometimes the answers were literal. The United States laid out in town names and zip codes. Sometimes a woman would say, "I am from last year," or "I am from the time before he left," or just, "I am from 12 minutes ago." And they would all nod because time is a different country when you are trying to make it to morning. They would nod, and then they would sleep, in a house that had learned to keep women safe. In the last page of the journal, which had been missing and then found and then saved, Eleanor had written a line that Sarah wrote again, in her own hand, on a card she put by the door for the women to see when they came and when they left. What would you do if your only hope was hidden in a place everyone else had forgotten? The question that had hung in the first breath of this was now the answer to the last. Today, if you drive down the gravel road that curls like ribbon through the firs, you will see a small sign hanging on a post that was a tree long enough ago to not remember that. The sign says Whitcomb Grove, hand-painted, the black letters fat and honest. There is a bell on the porch, brass and well-loved. If you pull it, it will sing. Someone will answer. Inside, a woman sits in a rocking chair with a baby asleep against her chest. The woman's hair is caught up and there's flour on her cheek like a small kiss. She looks up when you step in, and her face goes from "Who are you?" to "I have been waiting for you," like light changing at dawn. The fire in the stove makes the kind of soundtrack you cannot record and play back. The journal sits on the table with a new ribbon around it, and the vase beside it holds flowers that look like they were picked by somebody who did not plan the colors. It is quiet in the way that is everything. It is open in the way that is enough. It is late afternoon. The baby sighs. "Welcome home," she says.